When the heavy oak doors of St. Jude's Cathedral opened, the whispers did not stop. They grew louder. Every capo, hitman, and syndicate wife turned to stare at Bridget Sullivan, the bride whose soft, heavy curves broke every rule the Italian underworld respected. They called her a pig in a wedding dress. They said she had been sold to Roman Moretti to pay off a dead man's gambling debt. They thought her silence meant she was weak. They thought her shaking hands meant she was terrified. Even Roman, her cold-blooded new husband, believed he was getting a bride he could control. But Bridget Sullivan was not walking down that aisle as a sacrifice. She was watching every face, memorizing every threat, and waiting for the right moment to strike. By the end of the year, the same men who laughed at her body would be begging for mercy from the woman they thought they had already broken. The stained glass windows of the cathedral cast fractured, bleeding lights across the marble floor. But the beauty of the church was entirely lost on the congregation. They were here for a transaction, not a sacrament. Bridget stood at the threshold, the intricate lace of her designer gown stretching tightly across her broad hips and full chest. The dress had been commissioned by the Moretti family, and the tailor had made no secret of his disdain when taking her measurements, leaving the bodice suffocatingly tight. But Bridget did not adjust it. She kept her chin high, her breathing shallow, and her eyes fixed straight ahead. Waiting for her at the altar was Roman Moretti, 32 years old, built like a lightweight boxer, and possessing eyes as dead and gray as winter concrete. He was the newly ascended Don of the Chicago faction, a man who had secured his throne by orchestrating the quiet disappearances of 3 rival bosses. Roman did not look at her as she walked down the aisle. He checked his gold Patek Philippe watch. The whispers rolled through the pews like a physical draft. Look at the size of her. Arthur really fed her well before throwing her to the wolves. Roman must be sick to his stomach. All the models in the Gold Coast and he's shackled to a bakery display. It's just a debt settlement. He'll lock her in the estate and forget she exists. Bridget heard every word. She had spent her 26 years being underestimated, ignored, or openly ridiculed because of her weight, society, and particularly the hyper-masculine superficial underworld. Her father owed money to equated physical size with lethargy and softness with stupidity, which was a prejudice Bridget had long ago learned to weaponize. Her father, Arthur Sullivan, had been a brilliant forensic accountant before the blackjack tables consumed his soul. When he embezzled $5 million from the Moretti syndicate to cover his losses, Roman's enforcers have come to collect a pound of flesh. Arthur had offered the only thing he had left, his daughter. A legal marriage to Bridget gave Roman legitimate control over Arthur's remaining shell companies and real estate properties, washing the stolen $5 million clean through marital assets. When Bridget reached the altar, Roman finally turned to her. His jaw was tight. "Don't trip," he muttered under his breath, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Let's get this circus over with." "I have steady feet, Roman," she replied softly, her voice barely carrying over the choir. He didn't register the double meaning. The vows were exchanged in record time. There was no kiss, only a stiff turning of bodies to face the crowd. As they walked back up the aisle, Bridget began her work. While the mobsters thought she was staring blankly at the floor, her sharp eyes were cataloging every face, every whispered exchange, every subtle shift in body language. At the reception held in the sprawling ballroom of the Moretti Lake Forest estate, Bridget was practically abandoned at the head table. Roman spent the evening in a corner booth drinking scotch and smoking cigars with his inner circle, Lorenzo Rossi, his silver-haired, impeccably dressed consigliere, and Victor Romano, a volatile capo with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. Bridget sat alone, methodically cutting into her prime rib. She noticed that the waitstaff sneered when they poured her water, assuming her hearty appetite was a reflection of gluttony rather than a refusal to let them starve her out of intimidation. But as she chewed, she watched. She saw Alderman Richard Davies, a supposedly clean politician, slip a thick manila envelope to Victor Romano near the coat check. She saw Lorenzo Rossi exchange a long, meaningful glance with the head of a rival Russian faction, a look that lasted exactly 3 seconds too long to be hostile. It was a look of complicity. "They are laughing at me," Bridget thought, taking a sip of her sparkling water. "They look at me and see a fat, helpless girl sold to a monster. Good. Let them laugh. Let them ignore me." Before the night was over, Roman finally approached the head table. He smelled of expensive tobacco and violence. "My driver will take you to the West Wing," he said coldly. "You have an allowance. You have a chef. You will not interfere with my business. You will not ask questions. and you will not embarrass me in public. In return, you get to live a life of luxury. Do we understand each other?" Bridget looked up at him, her dark eyes entirely placid, perfectly Roman. "I prefer the quiet." He scoffed softly, turning on his heel. He thought he had bought a docile pet. He didn't know he had just brought a Trojan horse into his fortress. The first 3 months of the marriage were a master class in psychological isolation. Roman was practically a ghost. He operated out of his downtown penthouse, managing his illicit empire and legitimate fronts, leaving Bridget entirely alone in the sprawling 20-bedroom Lake Forest mansion. The cruelty of her reality wasn't handed down by Roman himself, but by the people he employed. The estate staff, taking their cues from the Doan's blatant neglect of his wife, treated Bridget with a suffocating mix of pity and contempt. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, was the worst. A stern woman in her 50s, Mrs. Gable routinely ignored Bridget's requests. If Bridget asked for a specific meal, Mrs. Gable would intentionally serve her heavy, greasy foods, once sneering, "I assumed you'd want the extra calories, Mom." Bridget never complained. She ate what was given, smiled politely, and retreated to the West Wing. The staff whispered that she was a depressed, lazy cow, content to hide in her room and gorge herself on Roman's dime. They were entirely wrong. Behind the locked mahogany doors of the West Wing, Bridget was working. Arthur Sullivan had been a terrible father, but he had taught his daughter the intricate, invisible architecture of money. Bridget understood offshore accounts, shell corporations, and phantom payrolls better than most seasoned cartel accountants. Her perceived invisibility was her greatest asset. Because no one respected her, no one monitored her. The estate security detail paid no attention to the heavyset wife taking midnight strolls to the kitchen. They didn't realize that on her way back, she was slipping into Roman's private study. Roman's physical security was top-tier armed guards, biometric locks on the exterior doors, but his internal digital security was arrogant. He assumed no one inside his house would dare cross him. Bridget easily bypassed the 6-digit passcode on his secondary server. It was the date of his father's assassination, a detail she remembered from old news clippings. Night after night, while the estate slept, Bridget sat in the glow of the monitors, her mind moving at blinding speeds. She downloaded ledgers, shipping manifests from the Chicago ports, and payroll documents for the construction unions Roman controlled. She transferred the data to an encrypted drive and analyzed it in her bedroom. By the end of the second month, Bridget found the anomaly. It started as a minor discrepancy in the shipping logs of a front company called Apex Logistics. Containers of electronics imported from Southeast Asia were being logged as a certain weight. The customs bribes was paying reflected a much heavier cargo. Someone was smuggling something else, weapons or narcotics, using Roman supply lines and pocketing the profits. Bridget dug deeper. She traced the phantom profits through a labyrinth of shell companies, eventually landing in a Cayman Islands account managed by a corrupt private banker named Philip Sterling. From Sterling, the money was being drip-fed back into Chicago, but it wasn't going to Roman. The money was going to Victor Romano, the volatile couple, and Lorenzo Rossi, the trusted consigliere. Bridget sat back in her plush armchair, the blue light of a laptop illuminating her face. Her heart beat a steady, calm rhythm. A coup. She realized Lorenzo and Victor were siphoning millions to build a war chest. They were hiring outside muscle, likely out-of-town mercenaries, preparing to take Roman out and seize the Chicago faction for themselves. She had to tell Roman, but how? If she simply called him, he would hang up. If she presented the evidence, he might assume she forged it as a desperate plea for attention. Or worse, that she was in on it. An opportunity arrived unexpectedly on a rainy Tuesday evening. Roman walked into the estate for the first time in weeks. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes betraying the immense pressure of running the syndicate. He sat in the formal dining room demanding a steak. Bridget joined him at the opposite end of the long oak table. For 20 minutes, the only sound was the clinking of silverware against fine china. "I hear the shipping yards are facing union strikes," Bridget said quietly, cutting a small piece of asparagus. Roman paused his fork halfway to his mouth. He glared at her, his eyes flashing with irritation. "Who told you that?" "I watch the local news, Roman, and I noticed the secondary trucks for Apex Logistics haven't been moving." Roman slammed his fist on the table, rattling the wine glasses. "I told you on our wedding day you do not ask questions. You do not involve yourself in my business. You sit here, you eat my food, and you keep your mouth shut. Do you understand, Mrs. Promes? Gable, standing in the corner, smirked visibly. Bridget didn't flinch. She placed her napkin on the table, her face a mask of serene composure. I understand, Roman. I will leave you to your dinner. She walked away, her steps heavy but deliberate. She had her answer. Roman was blind. His arrogance, the very trait that made him a feared Don, was the blinder Lorenzo and Victor were using to walk him straight to the slaughterhouse. If Bridget wanted to survive, because a dead Don meant a dead wife to tie up loose ends, she couldn't rely on Roman to save himself. She was going to have to save him. The climax of Lorenzo's plot was set for a Friday night during a mandatory sit-down at the Fontme Tackling Warehouse in the Fulton Market District. Through her continued surveillance of the encrypted servers, Bridget had intercepted a coded message between Victor and a freelance wetwork team operating out of Detroit. The plan was brutal and efficient. Roman was going to the warehouse believing he was arbitrating a dispute between Victor and a low-level street crew. In reality, the warehouse was a kill box. Roman's personal guards had already been bought off by Lorenzo. They would step aside. The Detroit team would move in and Roman would be executed. Lorenzo would take the throne by Monday morning as tragedy murdered boss. It was 9:20 p.m. Roman's motorcade had left the downtown penthouse 20 minutes ago. Bridget stood in the west wing of the estate, dressed entirely in black, a dark turtleneck, heavy slacks, and comfortable thick-soled boots. She pulled her hair back into a tight, severe bun. She looked at herself in the mirror. She didn't look like a mob wife. She looked like a woman going to war. She walked out of a suite and headed straight for the estate's underground garage. Mrs. Gable intercepted her in the hallway. "And where do you think you're going at this hour?" the housekeeper demanded, arms crossed. "Mr. Moretti doesn't like you leaving the grounds." Bridget didn't stop walking. She didn't even look at the woman. As she passed, Bridget smoothly reached out, gripped Mrs. Gable by the collar of her uniform, and shoved her hard against the wall. The older woman gasped in shock as Bridget pinned her there, her forearm pressing uncomfortably against the housekeeper's collarbone. "If you ever speak to me in that tone again, Helen," Bridget whispered, her voice carrying a terrifying icy weight, "I will have you buried under the rose garden. Go to your room and lock the door." She released the terrified woman and walked into the garage, taking the keys to an unassuming heavy-duty black SUV. Bridget drove through the slick, rain-soaked streets of Chicago with ruthless precision. She had a tablet mounted on the dashboard connected to Roman's mainframe. As she drove, her fingers danced over the screen. She couldn't physically fight 5 armed hitmen, but she didn't need to. She was an architect of systems. First, she logged into the Cayman accounts managed by Philip Sterling. Using the back door she had spent weeks coding, she executed a mass transfer. She didn't just freeze Lorenzo and Victor's war chest. She drained it, transferring the entire $7 million into a decentralized cryptocurrency wallet. Next, she hacked the Fulton Market Warehouse's ancient industrial control grid. The meat packing plant was defunct, but the power still ran to the heavy loading bay doors and the industrial alarms. By the time Bridget pulled into the alley behind the warehouse, the trap inside had already been sprung. Inside the cavernous, dimly lit building, Roman Moretti stood bleeding. His suit jacket was torn and a shallow bullet grazed a blood down his left arm. True to the intercepted plan, his bodyguards had vanished the moment they stepped inside. Now, Roman was pinned behind heavy steel shipping crates. Victor Romano walked slowly across the concrete floor, a suppressed submachine gun in his hands. 3 heavily armed thwart mercenaries flanked him. "It's nothing personal, Roman. War." Victor's voice echoed through the damp warehouse. "You're just too rigid. Lorenzo wants to expand into the narcotics trade, and you won't let us. So, we're taking the wheel." Roman gripped his pistol, his mind racing. He was outgunned, outmaneuvered, and betrayed by his closest friends. He had 1 magazine left. He prepared to stand up and die on his feet like a Moretti. Suddenly, the deafening screech of the warehouse's industrial alarm system shattered the air. Sirens blared with skull-rattling intensity, accompanied by blinding, flashing strobe lights that Bridget had triggered from her tablet outside. The mercenaries flinched, raising their hands to shield their eyes from the disorienting strobes. Victor spun around, screaming in confusion. Before they could recover, the massive corrugated steel doors of the loading bay violently buckled. With the roar of a V8 engine, Bridget's black SUV smashed through the metal barrier, sending shrapnel and debris flying across the floor. The heavy vehicle didn't slow down. It barreled straight toward the group of mercenaries. One of the hitmen raised his rifle, but he wasn't fast enough. The SUV clipped him, sending him sprawling into a stack of wooden pallets unconscious. Bridget slammed on the brakes, throwing the SUV into a violent drift that placed the armored bulk of the vehicle directly between Roman and Victor's remaining men. The passenger door swung open. Roman, stunned and bleeding, stared at the vehicle. He expected to see a rival gang, the FBI or loyalists he didn't know he had. Instead, peering over the center console, her face illuminated by the harsh dashboard lights, was his heavy-set, utterly dismissive wife. Her eyes were as cold and calculating as a predator's. "Get in, husband," Bridget commanded, her voice cutting cleanly through the blaring alarms. "Your consigliere just sold you out for $7 million, and your triggerman only has 15 rounds left in that magazine. Move." Roman didn't hesitate. Survival instinct overrode his shock. He dove into the passenger seat just as Victor and the remaining mercenaries opened fire. The bullets sparked and pinged harmlessly off the reinforced steel doors of the heavy SUV. Bridget threw the car into reverse tires, smoking on the slick concrete. She spun the wheel, executing a flawless J-turn, and blasted back out into the Chicago rain, leaving Victor screaming in the ruins of his failed ambush. Inside the speeding car, the silence was heavy save for the hum of the engine. Roman pressed a hand to his bleeding arm, staring at the woman beside him as if seeing her for the very first time. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't crying. Her grip on the steering wheel was relaxed, masterful. Bridget reached over, picked up the tablet from the console, and dropped it onto Roman's lap. The offshore ledgers, the intercepted communications, and the bank transfers, Bridget said, not taking her eyes off the road. Victor and Lorenzo funded this with the Apex Logistics skim. I drained their accounts 3 minutes ago. They are currently broke, panicked, and exposed. Roman looked at the tablet. The undeniable proof of his closest ally's treason was laid out in meticulous, color-coded spreadsheets. He looked back at Bridget, the woman he had treated like a piece of ugly furniture, the woman who had just outsmarted his entire criminal syndicate from a locked bedroom in the West Wing. "Who the hell are you?" Roman breathed, the authority completely stripped from his voice. Bridget offered a small, terrifying smile. "I'm the joke of the underworld, Roman, and starting tonight I am your new consigliere." The black SUV didn't return to the Lake Forest estate. Bridget knew Lorenzo would have already sent men to secure the mansion, lock down the staff, and wait for news of Roman's demise. Instead, she drove deep into the industrial heart of the Pilsen neighborhood, pulling into an abandoned textile mill that looked like a rotting brick corpse from the outside. Inside, however, the heavy steel freight elevator descended into a sprawling, hypermodern bunker. The space was climate-controlled, lit by recessed LED strips, and equipped with a surgical suite, a server farm, and an armory. Roman gripped his bleeding arm, stumbling slightly as he stepped out of the vehicle. He looked around the immaculate safe house, his gray eyes wide with disbelief. "This isn't one of my properties. Not even the capos know about this." "They don't?" Bridget said, her voice brisk and professional, as she guided him toward the sterile metal table in the medical bay. "This property is registered to a subsidiary of a shell company owned by Arthur Sullivan. My father might have been a degenerate gambler, Roman, but he was a paranoid accountant. He built this place in case the feds thought you ever came for him. Sit down. I need to close that graze before you bleed out on the linoleum." Roman sat wincing as she unceremoniously tore the sleeve of his ruined Brioni suit. He watched her move. There was no hesitation, no squeamishness. She retrieved the medical kit, tore open a sterile suture packet, and began to clean the wound with iodine. Her hands, which she had once thought were soft and useless, were remarkably steady. "You've been holding out on me, Bridget," Roman grunted as the needle pierced his skin. "You never asked," she replied evenly, tying off a flawless knot. "You gave me an allowance, a chef, and told me to be a ghost. I simply followed instructions. While you were smoking cigars and ignoring the rotting foundations of your own empire, I was auditing it." Roman felt a flash of anger, but it was quickly eclipsed by a profound, jarring respect. He looked at her face, the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes, the set of her jaw. For the first time, he didn't see the heavy, quiet girl from the cathedral. He saw a woman who possessed an intimidating gravitational pull. Her size, her presence, it wasn't laziness, it was an anchor. She was the immovable object in a world full of chaotic, violent men. "Tell me everything," he commanded, his tone shifting. It was no longer the voice of a Don talking to a civilian. It was a man consulting a partner. As Bridget finished bandaging his arm, She laid out the grim reality of his syndicate. She explained how Lorenzo Rossi, his mentor and godfather, had been plotting this coup for over a year. She detailed how Victor Romano had bribed Alderman Richard Davies with a cool $2 million to ensure the police would look the other way when Roman's body was dumped in the Chicago River. She even named the corrupt private banker in the Cayman Islands, Philip Sterling, who had facilitated the laundering. "Sterling's a dead man," Roman growled, gripping the edge of the metal table. "And Lorenzo, I'll skin him alive." "No, you won't," Bridget corrected him calmly, walking over to a stainless steel sink to wash the blood from her hands. "Revenge is emotional. It's messy. If you go out there tomorrow and start a street war, the federal government will use the RICO Act to dismantle whatever is left of your family. The FBI is already circling. We don't shoot Lorenzo, we bankrupt him. We isolate him, and we let his own greed choke him to death." Roman narrowed his eyes. "He has the loyalty of the capos. He has my men." Bridget turned off the faucet, drying her hands on a towel. She turned to face him, a terrifying predatory smile touching her lips. He had their loyalty because he had $7 million to pay them. As of 30 minutes ago, that money is sitting in a cold storage crypto wallet in my pocket, and tomorrow morning we are going to go shopping for some new loyalties. Roman stared at his wife. The sheer audacity of her plan, the cold calculating brilliance of it, struck him like a physical blow. He suddenly realized the magnitude of his mistake. He had bought a pawn to settle a debt. He had accidentally married a queen who was already 3 moves ahead of the entire board. "All right, consigliere," Roman said, a dark, genuine smirk finally breaking across his face. "What's our next move?" The Union League Club of Chicago was an establishment that thrived on mahogany walls, leather armchairs, and the scent of old money. It was neutral ground, a place where politicians, judges, and high-level criminals could drink bourbon and pretend they weren't all feeding from the same bloody trough. It was 1 a.m. on Saturday. In a private soundproof dining room on the 4th floor, Lorenzo Rossi sat at the head of a long table. To his right sat Victor Romano, looking agitated and nursing a bruised ego from the warehouse debacle. To his left were Alderman Richard Davies and Judge Harrison Whitfield, the political shields who kept the Moretti family out of federal prison. "Roman Moretti is dead," Lorenzo announced to the room, his silver hair perfectly coiffed and his voice dripping with faux sorrow. "It was an ambush by the Detroit factions. We couldn't save him. As of this morning, I'm assuming control of the syndicate to ensure stability. We will strike back at Detroit, but first we need to consolidate our assets." Judge Whitfield adjusted his glasses, looking nervous. "And what of his wife? The Sullivan girl?" Rictus sneered, crossing his arms. "The fat miss missing. Probably ran crying back to whatever hole her father crawled out of. She's not a threat. She's practically illiterate when it comes to the business." "Is that so, Victor?" The heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open. The 2 armed guards Lorenzo had stationed outside were nowhere to be seen. Instead, standing in the doorway blocking the exit with her formidable presence was Bridget. She wore a tailored, double-breasted crimson blazer that accentuated her broad shoulders and full curves paired with jet-black trousers. She looked like royalty. Standing right behind her, very much alive and holding a suppressed Heckler & Koch USP tactical pistol, was Roman Moretti. The blood drained from Lorenzo's face. He stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair tipped backward and crashed to the floor. Victor reached for his holster, but Roman raised his weapon, the laser sight painting a red dot squarely between Victor's eyes. "Hands on the table, Victor," Roman said softly. "Unless you want to decorate the wainscoting." Victor slowly raised his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. Bridget walked into the room with measured, heavy steps. The rhythmic click-clack of her heels on the hardwood floor sounded like a countdown. She didn't look at Lorenzo. She walked straight toward the politicians. She tossed a thick black leather binder onto the table in front of Alderman Davies. It landed with a loud, authoritative thud. "Good morning, Alderman," Bridget said, her voice smooth as glass. "I believe you were expecting a wire transfer of $2 million from an offshore account managed by Philip Sterling." Davies swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. I don't know what you're talking about, Mrs. Moretti. Please, Richard, don't insult my intelligence," Bridget replied, flipping the binder open. "I have the routing numbers, the encrypted emails, and the security footage of you taking a manila envelope from Victor at my wedding reception. I also have the tax records proving you've been hiding your kickbacks in a shell company registered to your sister-in-law in Delaware. She leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the table, her imposing figure looming over the corrupt politician. Philip Sterling was arrested by Interpol at Heathrow Airport 3 hours ago, courtesy of an anonymous tip containing his entire ledger. Your $2 million evaporated, but I have it now. Lorenzo finally found his voice. This is insane, Roman. She's filling your head with lies. I am your godfather. Roman didn't look at Lorenzo. His eyes were fixed entirely on Bridget, watching her dismantle the most powerful men in the city with nothing but a binder and a brain. He was utterly transfixed. Bridget slowly turned her gaze to Lorenzo. Her eyes were devoid of any warmth. You're a parasite, Lorenzo. You skimmed from the family. You plotted to murder your Don, and you thought you could fund a war with stolen money. My men will be here any second, Victor spat, trying to regain some leverage. There are 30 hitters downstairs in the lobby. You're dead, Roman, both of you. Bridget actually laughed. It was a rich, dark sound that sent shivers down Judge Whitfield's spine. She reached into her blazer and pulled out a sleek smartphone, tapping the screen a few times before tossing it to Victor. Look at the bank application, Victor, she instructed. Victor looked at the screen, his eyes wide in absolute horror. Your account balance, which was supposed to hold the $7 million, pay the Detroit mercenaries and the 30 hitters downstairs, read 0. I transferred the funds last night, Bridget explained casually as if she were discussing the weather. And then at 8 a.m. this morning, I sent a mass encrypted text to every single one of your loyal hitters downstairs. I offered them double what you promised, paid immediately in untraceable cryptocurrency on the condition that they stand down and swear allegiance directly to Roman. She paused, letting silence hang in the room. They accepted, Bridget concluded. There is no army coming to save you, Victor. Your men work for me now. The politician is mine. The judge is mine. You have absolutely nothing. The room was deathly quiet. The realization of what had just happened settled over Lorenzo and Victor like a suffocating shroud. They hadn't been outgunned. They had been outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and financially eviscerated by a woman they had deemed too fat and lazy to notice them. Roman stepped forward, lowering his gun. He didn't need it anymore. Bridget had already fired the fatal shot. He looked at Lorenzo, his former mentor, a pathetic, broken man with no money and no friends. Lorenzo, Roman said, his voice cold and final, you have exactly 1 hour to leave Chicago. If you or Victor are ever seen in this city or any city I operate in, my wife will freeze every asset you ever touch, and then I will send men to finish the job. Lorenzo didn't argue. He looked at Bridget, true fear finally registering in his eyes. He slowly nodded, turning toward the door, Victor trailing behind him like a beaten dog. As the door clicked shut, Alderman Davies and Judge Whitfield sat frozen in their chairs. Bridget closed the binder. She looked at the two sweating men. Gentlemen, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, you work for the Moretti family now. Bus, if you ever vote against our interests or sign a warrant with our names on it, I will ruin your lives before you can finish your morning coffee. Are we clear, Crystal? Judge Whitfield stammered. Bridget turned and walked out of the room. Roman followed closely behind. As they stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut to separate them from the trembling politicians, Roman finally let out a long breath. He looked at his wife. She was adjusting the cuff of her crimson blazer, completely unbothered by the fact that she had just executed the most flawless coup d'etat in the history of the Chicago Syndicate. Roman reached out his hand, gently wrapping around her wrist. It was the first time he had touched her with genuine intentions since the day they met. You, Roman murmured, a rough edge of desire creeping into his voice, are the most terrifying thing I have ever seen. Bridget looked up at him, her dark eyes flashing with a confident, undeniable heat. Get used to it, Roman, she whispered. We have a lot of work to do. The transition of power in the Chicago Syndicate was not televised, nor was it written about in the local papers, but the tectonic plates of the city's underworld shifted with absolute, terrifying violence. Within 48 hours of Lorenzo Rossi's exile, the old guard was entirely dismantled. Those who swore fealty to Roman and his new, unseen consigliere were spared. Those who hesitated were quietly erased from the board by the very mercenaries Lorenzo had tried to hire. But the true revolution wasn't in the blood spilled, it was in the ledgers. Bridget Sullivan completely overhauled the Moretti family's operations. She sequestered herself in Roman's downtown penthouse, turning the sprawling glass-walled office into a war room of white boards, encrypted servers, and financial blueprints. She systematically dissolved the outdated high-risk rackets, the street-level extortion, the messy protection rings, and funneled the syndicate's capital into high-frequency trading algorithms, aggressively aggressive real estate acquisitions in the Fulton Market District, and the labyrinth of decentralized offshore trusts. She wasn't just laundering money, she was institutionalizing the Mafia. She made them legitimate, untouchable, and infinitely wealthier. Profits surged by 400% in a matter of 6 months, and as the empire grew, so did the intoxicating, dangerous dynamic between the Don and his wife. Roman had spent his entire life surrounded by women who adhered to the strict, superficial standards of the mob life, wafer-thin, surgically enhanced, and subservient. He'd thought power was defined by physical intimidation and a quick trigger finger. Bridget shattered every single one of his preconceived notions. It happened late one evening in November. The penthouse was quiet, save for the rhythmic tapping of Bridget's keyboard. She was sitting at the massive mahogany desk, wearing a silk robe that draped elegantly over her full, soft curves, a glass of expensive Barolo resting near her mousepad. Roman walked into the office, pouring himself a bourbon. He leaned against the doorframe, subtly watching her. He watched the sharp, calculating focus in her dark eyes, the confident set of her jaw, the way she commanded millions of dollars with a single keystroke. He felt a deep, unfamiliar ache in his chest, a potent mixture of absolute reverence and raw, burning desire. He set his glass down, crossed the room, and gently closed her laptop. Bridget looked up, an eyebrow raised in quiet question. "I was in the middle of routing the union pension funds through the Luxembourger accounts. Roman, the funds can wait," he murmured, his voice low and gravelly. He stepped behind her chair, his large calloused hands resting on her broad shoulders. He felt her tense slightly, but she didn't pull away. Slowly, his thumbs began to massage the tight muscles at the base of her neck. "You've been working for 14 hours, Roman said, leaning down so his lips were mere inches from her ear. "You run my city, you run my men, you hold my life in your hands every single day, but you still look at me like you expect me to send you back to the west wing of the estate." Bridget turned her head slightly, her dark eyes meeting his steely gray ones. "I'm a realist, Roman. I know exactly what I am, and I know exactly what men like you value." Roman let out a soft, almost angry scoff. He spun her chair around to face him, gripping the armrests and leaning in close. "Men like me? You think I'm like the idiots who laughed at you in that cathedral, Bridget? The women I used to know were ghosts. They were empty. You are an empire. Every ounce of you is power. I don't just respect you. I worship you." He didn't wait for her to analyze his words. He leaned down and captured her lips in a kiss that was desperate, bruising, and entirely consuming. Bridget gasped, her hands instinctively coming up to grip the lapels of his tailored shirt. For years, she had weaponized her size, using it as an invisible shield to make men underestimate her. But here, in Roman's arms, she wasn't a shield, she was a goddess. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathless. Roman rested his forehead against hers, his hands tracing the soft, heavy curve of her hips through the silk robe. "You are never going back to the shadows," he whispered fiercely. "You belong at the head of the table with me." That night cemented their partnership in blood, money, and a fierce, obsessive love. They became the undisputed king and queen of Chicago, but massive success in the underworld never goes unnoticed. The noise of Chicago's explosive financial growth inevitably reached the East Coast, and the old wolves of New York were hungry. In January, a summons arrived. Vincent Castellano, the ruthlessly conservative head of the New York Commission and the most powerful don in the country, requested a sit-down. Castellano was a man of the old world, a man who believed women belonged in the kitchen or the church, and certainly not in the boardroom of a criminal syndicate. Word had reached New York that Roman Moretti was taking orders from his heavy-set bride, and Castellano viewed it as a fatal weakness, a joke that insulted the tradition of La Cosa Nostra. The meeting was set for a private, heavily guarded estate in the Hamptons. "It's a power play," Bridget said, packing a customized armored briefcase in their bedroom. "Castellano wants to absorb the Chicago operation. He'll use my position as an excuse to claim you've gone soft, that you've broken tradition. He's going to demand you step down, or he'll threaten a war with the 5 families." Roman loaded a fresh magazine into his shoulder holster, his jaw tight. If Castellano disrespects you, I'll put a bullet in his throat in front of his own capos. Commission be damned. Bridget walked over to him, placing a gentle hand on his chest. No, you won't. Castellano has 200 made men in the tri-state area. We don't beat him with bullets, Roman. We beat him the same way we beat Lorenzo. We let him choke on his own arrogance. She offered that terrifying, brilliant smile. Let him look at me and see a fat, useless wife. It's the last mistake he'll ever make. The Castellano estate in the Hamptons was a sprawling fortress of white brick and manicured lawns overlooking the freezing steel-gray waters of the Atlantic. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on as Roman's black SUV pulled up to the grand entrance. Inside the massive dining room, a long mahogany table was set for a war council. Vincent Castellano sat at the head. He was a man in his late 60s, with a face like tanned leather and eyes like chips of flint. Flanking him were his top lieutenants, including Albert the Butcher Duca, a massive, terrifying enforcer known for his sadistic methods. When Roman entered the room with Bridget by his side, Castellano didn't stand. He didn't even offer a nod of respect. He took a slow drag from his cigar, blowing the smoke toward the vaulted ceiling. Roman. Castellano rumbled, his voice thick with a Brooklyn accent. Sit down. We have business to discuss. Roman pulled out a chair for Bridget, waiting until she was seated before taking the chair next to her. The New York capos exchanged mocking, thinly veiled smirks. The sight of the broad, heavily built woman sitting at a commission table was deeply offensive to their sensibility. I'll get right to the point, Castellano said, leaning forward. Church is making a lot of noise. You're pulling in numbers that are making the federal government twitchy. But worse than that, Roman is the word on the street. They say you're letting a skirt run the books. They say Arthur Sullivan's fat little girl is giving orders to made men. Roman's hand drifted toward his jacket, but under the table Bridget placed a firm, restraining hand on his knee. Tradition is what keeps us alive. Roman, Castellano continued, his eyes locking onto Bridget with absolute disdain. You broke it. You look weak. So, the commission has made a decision. You're going to hand over the Chicago ledgers to Albert here. You will pay a 20% tax to New York for the next 5 years. And you will send the woman home to make cookies where she belongs. Castellano leaned back, a smug smile on his face. Refuse, and you won't leave this island alive. I have 40 men surrounding this house. The silence in the room was absolute. Roman looked at Bridget. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply yielded the floor to his queen. Bridget did not look intimidated. She didn't shrink under the hateful stares of the most dangerous men in America. Instead, she reached into her tailored blazer and pulled out a sleek silver flash drive, placing it gently on the center of the table. Vincent, Bridget said. Her voice was smooth as cultured and utterly devoid of fear. Do you know what happens to money when it gets bored? Castellano frowned, his cigar hovering near his mouth. What the hell is she talking about? Money likes to move, Bridget explained, her dark eyes locking onto the New York dawn. When you sit on a massive fortune, it gets restless. And you, Vincent, have been very, very greedy. For the last decade, you've been skimming from the Commission's shared pension fund. You've been taking a 5% cut from the Lucchese and Gambino operations and hiding it in a series of shell companies based in Malta. Castellano's face went rigid. The color slowly drained from his leathery cheeks. You shut your mouth. You stupid, I didn't just find the accounts. Vincent, Bridget interrupted, her voice suddenly cracking like a whip, echoing off the high ceilings. I drained them last night at 2 a.m. I took $400 million of your stolen money and I redistributed it, but I didn't keep it. She gestured elegantly to the silver flash drive on the table. I sent the ledgers proving your theft, along with their missing money, directly to the heads of the other 4 families in New York, Bridget said, leaning forward, her presence suddenly filling the entire room, suffocating the men around her. I also sent them the routing numbers showing that you used that stolen money to buy private jets, real estate in Dubai, and a yacht for your mistress. Albert Duca shifted uncomfortably, looking at his boss with sudden dawning suspicion. In the Mafia, stealing from your own partners was a sin punishable only by a gruesome death. You're lying, Castellano spat. But a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. You couldn't possibly get past my encryption. Your encryption was a joke, Vincent. You used the same offshore banker that Lorenzo Rossi used, a man who was very eager to trade your passwords for a lighter sentence with Interpol. Bridget smiled, a cold, terrifying expression. Right now, the heads of the other 4 families are reading those emails. They realize you've been robbing them blind for 10 years. Just then, Castellano's burner phone resting on the table buzzed violently. Then Albert Duca's phone buzzed. Then the phone of every single New York capo in the room began to vibrate in a chaotic symphony of incoming messages. Albert picked up his phone. He read the text message. His eyes went wide. He slowly looked up, not at Bridget, but at Vincent Castellano. "Albert," Castellano said, his voice trembling slightly. "Don't listen to her. It's a trick. The message is from Don Luz's." Albert growled, his voice deadly quiet. "You attached a bank statement. You stole from us, Vince. You stole from the families." Bridget folded her hands neatly on the table. "I suggest you look out the window, Vincent." Castellano slowly turned his head. Through the massive bay windows, a fleet of black SUVs was speeding up the long driveway, tearing through the manicured lawns. But they weren't Castellano's men. They bore the license plates and insignias of the other 4 New York families. They had come for the traitor. "You have 40 men outside, Vincent?" Bridget asked softly. "The commission just sent 200. And they aren't here for Roman. They are here for you." Castellano jumped to his feet, his hand reaching for his weapon, pure panic in his eyes. "Kill them, Albert. Kill them both." Albert Duca didn't move to protect his boss. Instead, he drew his own pistol and aimed it squarely at Castellano's chest. The other capos in the room did the same. The loyalty Castellano had bought was instantly shattered by the revelation of his betrayal. "Sit down, Vince," Albert commanded, his finger tight on the trigger. "You're going to have a little chat with the commission." Roman stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a calm, predatory grace. He walked over to Bridget and pulled her chair back for her. She stood smoothing the fabric of her slacks. She looked down at the broken, hyperventilating dawn of New York. "You looked at me and saw a fat, useless girl," Bridget said, her voice dropping to a whisper that chilled the blood of every hitman in the room. "And because of that, you never saw the blade coming until it was already buried in your spine. Let this be a lesson to whatever is left of your family." Roman wrapped a protective, deeply possessive arm around Bridget's waist. He looked at Albert Duca. "Chicago is autonomous. We pay no tax. We answer to no one. You tell the commission that if they ever disrespect my wife again, I won't just bankrupt them. I'll burn New York to the ground." Albert slowly nodded, his eyes fixed on Bridget with a new-found absolute terror. "Understood, Roman. We have no quarrel with Chicago." They walked out of the dining room, leaving Vincent Castellano to his bloody fate. The heavy oak doors sealed behind them, shutting out the screams and the inevitable gunfire that followed when they stepped out into the freezing Atlantic wind. The rival hitmen from the other families parted like the Red Sea, lowering their weapons in a silent show of respect as the King and Queen of Chicago walked to their vehicle. And inside the warm leather interior of the SUV, Roman pulled Bridget into his lap. He didn't care about the driver. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling her scent, expensive perfume, and absolute intoxicating victory. "We're going to need a bigger war room," Roman murmured against her skin, his hands tracing the soft, powerful curves of the woman who had just conquered the American underworld without firing a single shot. Bridget ran her fingers through Roman's dark hair as the Castellano estate disappeared behind them. For the first time that night, she smiled. "The real work starts tomorrow, husband," she whispered. "This empire is only beginning." Bridget Sullivan had entered the underworld as a debt no one wanted to claim. She left as the woman every capo feared. They mocked her body, mistook her silence for weakness, and believed Roman Moretti had married a sacrifice. Instead, he had married the mind that would rebuild his empire and bury anyone who stood against them. She turned every insult into strategy, every act of disrespect into leverage, and every enemy into proof that they had underestimated the wrong bride. Bridget was no longer the discarded woman in a silk gown. She was the queen of the Mafia, and she knew exactly what she was worth. For more dark Mafia romance, revenge, power plays, and women who rise higher than the men who tried to break them, hit like, share this story, and subscribe for the next underworld drama.